The torches were already dying when I first read the accounts, faint embers glowing against the marble silence of a vanished empire. If you have come here seeking beauty, you may find it, but you'll find something else too. Something that lingered behind silk veils and perfumed corridors. You clicked on the right story. This is the night the princesses of Persia learned to fear love itself. I remember the first time I found her name written in the chronicles of the Safavid court. Zahra bint Darius, a daughter of impossible grace, promised to a prince whose power was whispered to eclipse mercy. They said her wedding night was a festival of gold and jasmine. Yet beneath the gold, beneath the hymns of celebration, was a ritual darker than any pagan oath. The scribes of the 16th century never spoke plainly of it. They buried the truth under metaphors. The moon waned red, one wrote. The garden fell silent before dawn. But when you've studied the Persian courts as long as I have, you learn to read what was never meant to be read aloud. Imagine it with me. A palace of turquoise light and shadow, walls breathing with the scent of myrrh, slaves gliding silently through corridors, bearing bowls of rosewater. Somewhere, deep in the women's quarters, a girl sits alone, a child dressed as a queen. Her henna'd hands tremble. The gold anklets at her feet glint like shackles. Outside, the city celebrates. Drums echo through Isfahan, fireworks bloom over domes, and the people toast to divine union. But in the heart of the palace, union means something else. It means surrender. It means silence. The princess has been taught that love is obedience, that her first cry on the wedding night will not be heard by the gods, but by the walls, and the walls will keep her secret. The eunuchs will say nothing. The midwives will burn the linens before dawn, and by morning she will wear her fear like another jewel, hidden beneath layers of silk, unseen but heavy. History tells us Persia was a land of philosophers, poets, and astronomers, a cradle of brilliance. And yet, in those very courts where Omar Khayyam wrote of wine and ecstasy, royal women lived in exquisite captivity. Their beauty was currency, their innocence tribute. Every marriage alliance was a bargain struck between dynasties, and the girl at its center, always voiceless, was both the offering and the price. In the archives of Shiraz, there is a passage that has haunted me for years. It speaks of the ceremony of the veil, performed before every royal wedding. The bride was presented to the court's elders, her face covered in gauze so fine it seemed woven from mist. The veil symbolized purity, yes, but also submission. It was not meant to protect her modesty. It was meant to remind her she no longer belonged to herself. When I first read that, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ancient parchment in my hands. Because in those same descriptions, the scribes note the bride's silence. Not once in the centuries of Persian chronicles does a princess speak in her own voice. Not once. And so, the stories that remain, the fear, the ritual, the quiet suffering, must be told through the ghosts of those who could not speak, through the trembling ink of male historians and the half-erased verses of forgotten poets. I often wonder what it felt like, that night, to stand in a room lit by gold, knowing that beauty itself had become your prison. To smell roses and incense, and know that their sweetness was masking something rotten. They say the morning after every royal wedding, a drop of blood was offered to the gods, proof of purity, proof of power. But what the chronicles fail to mention is that sometimes the gods were not satisfied. Those brides who did not bleed were whispered to be cursed. Those who screamed were silenced, and those who survived never spoke of what they endured again. The empire called it sanctity. I call it sanctioned terror. When you look at those old Persian paintings, the ones you see in museums, the princesses with coal-lined eyes and lotus hands, you're seeing masks, not faces. The painters were court men. They painted what flattered the throne, not what haunted the bedchamber. The truth, the reason Persian princesses feared their wedding night is not just about cruelty. It's about control. It's about an empire that worshipped beauty but feared women. And so, their fear became tradition. Tradition became legend. And legend was carved into the foundations of palaces that still stand, silent witnesses to a history most prefer to romanticize. I've read the poetry, I've studied the treaties, but nothing speaks louder than what was never written. The silence of Persian princesses is the loudest story in their empire's history. When you trace fear to its root, it always leads to power. And in Persia, power was an art form, painted, perfumed, and precise. By the 17th century, the Safavid dynasty had woven an empire from the bones of 1,000 tribes. It stood as a crossroads of silk and blood, where poets were honored and heads could still roll before the call to prayer. From the outside, it glittered. From the inside, it was held together by oaths whispered in the dark. I've spent years poring over royal decrees and travel diaries written by those who witnessed that splendor. Each account is a mirror, and every mirror reflects a different lie. The European envoys spoke of a land of angels veiled in gold. The Persian scribes called it an empire guarded by modesty. But in truth, it was guarded by fear. Fear of change, fear of shame, fear of women who might think beyond the role assigned to them. Marriage among the royal houses was not love nor even alliance. It was a signature carved into the flesh of dynasties. Each princess became a message, a living treaty sent from father to king, from uncle to enemy. Her worth was measured in bloodline, her silence in loyalty. I once found a document sealed with crimson wax, a marriage contract written for a Safavid princess promised to a Turkoman warlord. The text praised her lineage, her beauty, her dowry of jewels, but nowhere did it mention her name. Not once, just the maiden of the House of Abbas, as though her identity was too delicate, too disposable to survive ink. That is the first cruelty of power, to erase the person and preserve only the symbol. Persian culture, for all its refinement, was deeply hierarchical, an empire of masks. Even the monarch wore one. Shah Abbas himself, the great reformer and tyrant, was said to have dined behind a golden lattice so that no subject might ever look directly upon him. Visibility was privilege, invisibility was protection. And for the women of the court, invisibility became their armor. They lived in seclusion, surrounded by attendants, musicians, and guards. The Anderun, the inner sanctum of the palace, a world within a world. To outsiders, it seemed like paradise, fountains, gardens, silk cushions, the the scent of saffron in the air. But I've read the letters of the foreign wives who glimpsed that world, and their words carry a different fragrance, one of boredom, suspicion, and quiet despair. One Venetian visitor wrote, "They speak softly, for every echo might carry to the king's ear." Another more bluntly, "They live as birds in a gilded cage." It is easy to romanticize the Persian court, to imagine elegance without consequence. But beauty in those halls was not freedom, it was surveillance. The women's every gesture was rehearsed, their every smile calculated to maintain the illusion of serenity. I recall one miniature painting from the Safavid period, a royal wedding scene, delicate as lace. The bride stands beneath an archway, her face half turned from the viewer. You cannot see her eyes. The painter knew better than to show them. In that omission lies the whole history of the Persian woman's silence. Fear, after all, does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through painted silk and polished stone. It is tempting to blame the kings, the mullahs, the ministers, and they do deserve blame. But the truth runs deeper. The system was built by tradition, reinforced by poetry, sanctified by religion, and performed by those who no longer knew another way to live. Even the mothers, who once trembled before their own wedding nights, taught their daughters to accept it. That, perhaps, is the cruelest inheritance of all, to call your chains holy. And yet, not every woman bowed. History, in its dusty mercy, preserves fragments, letters from concubines who became confidants, wives who advised kings, poets who smuggled verses under false names. They were rare, yes, but they existed, and their words, fragile as they are, show that beneath the veil of fear, intellect burned quietly. One such woman was Mahin Banu Begum, aunt to Shah Tahasp, who ruled in his stead during his youth. Contemporary accounts call her a woman of unshakable mind and terrifying calm. She governed provinces, negotiated treaties, and silenced rivals with nothing but a glance. Yet even she was bound by ritual. The moment her nephew came of age, she vanished from record, retreating into the shadows of the harem. Her fate remains unrecorded. Perhaps that was her choice. Or perhaps history, ever loyal to its kings, chose to forget her. When I read her decrees, her handwriting strong and elegant, I imagine the same quiet rebellion that must have flickered in the hearts of many Persian princesses, a knowledge that they were more than the roles written for them. But knowledge without power is a dangerous possession. In the courts of Persia, it was as sharp as a hidden blade, and that blade cut in silence. The more I study the rituals of those courts, the more I realize that fear was not accidental, it was engineered. It was tradition's most loyal guardian. To keep a people obedient, teach them reverence. To keep a woman silent, teach her that silence is virtue. That was the true law of the empire. And so, when the wedding drums thundered through the city, and the torches burned all night, the people celebrated purity and obedience, never knowing that, behind those walls, a princess prayed not for love, but for endurance. I remember once standing in Isfahan, in the ruins of Ali Kapu Palace. The ceilings are still painted with hunting scenes, gazelles, falcons, flowers. But in the corner, high above where anyone would look, there's a small, faded image, a woman, painted in the act of turning away, her gaze lost to the years. Sometimes I think she was not painted by order, but by memory, the small act of defiance by the artist who knew the truth. Because every empire leaves a secret in its art, and Persia's secret was that its beauty was built upon fear. Fear, once taught, becomes language, and in the palaces of Persia it was spoken fluently. When I walk through the ruins of their cities, I can almost hear it. Not screams, but etiquette. Not chains, but rules spoken so softly that even centuries later they still echo in the marble. Every gesture had meaning. To bow too low was weakness. To bow too little, defiance. A princess learned early that survival meant mastery of nuance. One misplaced glance could undo a family alliance. One misplaced word could stain a dynasty. So she learned to speak in symbols. The color of her robe, the slant of her perfume, the length of her silence. Superstition did the rest. The court physicians whispered of omens and humors. Astrologers charted the fates of royal brides before they drew breath. The alignment of the moon could decide a marriage, a comet, a cancellation. To defy the stars was to defy heaven, and no one in that world defied heaven. I once translated a fragment from a royal diary, written by a tutor of the harem. He recorded that every new princess was visited by the court's astrologer 3 nights before her wedding. She would be shown the stars and told the same phrase, "The heavens have already written your joy and sorrow. To resist is folly." It sounds like prophecy. In truth, it was programming. The system fed itself. The mothers who had endured learned to mask pain with piety, to call obedience virtue, to teach their daughters that serenity was survival. In that way, fear became hereditary, passed not through blood, but through bedtime stories. I remember one such legend, common among the palace servants, the tale of the mirror bride. They said that long ago, a princess vanished the night before her wedding. In her chamber, they found only a mirror, veiled in black silk. Anyone who looked into it claimed to see her eyes staring back, filled with accusation. For generations, that story was told to young girls as warning. Do not question destiny, lest the mirror remember you. It was only when I read between the lines of the court chronicles that I realized the story's true purpose. It was not about ghosts at all. It was about control. Fear was the guard that needed no chains. Outside the palace walls, Persia was changing, the bazaars filled with foreign merchants. Gunpowder replaced the bow. Philosophers argued over faith and reason. But within the royal household, time stood still. The rituals, the segregation, the codes of modesty, all preserved like insects in amber. That was how the Safavid dynasty maintained its image, through the illusion of divine order. A king's household was the microcosm of his realm. If the women were pure and silent, the empire was righteous. If they rebelled, heaven itself might turn away. So said the priests, so believed the people. It is strange, reading those sermons now. They speak of virtue and loyalty, yet they reek of fear. Not the fear of sin, but the fear of collapse, as though even the smallest crack in obedience might shatter the empire's mirror. And perhaps it would have. For when you build power on the worship of perfection, imperfection is rebellion. The princesses understood this. They became curators of illusion, maintaining a serenity that concealed exhaustion. The poets praised them for their stillness. not knowing that stillness was the only safe expression left to them. Sometimes I think of the palace gardens, the nightingales, the fountains, the slow drift of petals on water, and I realize they were not decorations, but distractions. Beauty was the empire's anesthetic. If everything glittered, no one needed to question what it hid. But fear, even when buried under gold, does not die. It changes shape. It becomes prophecy, etiquette, art. It lingers in phrases of caution that survive long after their purpose is forgotten. When I listen to the old Persian proverbs still spoken today, the rose does not speak of its thorns. Obedience keeps the garden whole. I hear the echo of those chambers. And yet, for all its cruelty, that system was fragile. The same education that silenced the royal women also made them scholars. They could read poetry, philosophy, scripture. Knowledge slipped through the cracks of fear, like water through stone. Quietly, they began to write, not openly, but in margins. In coded verses attributed to male poets, in embroidery patterns that spelled names no one was meant to see. That, to me, is the most haunting part of the story. The resistance that dared not call itself rebellion. I once handled a scrap of silk found in a royal archive, covered in gold thread and stitched verses from Hafez. Hidden between the lines, in minuscule Persian script, were two additional words: "We remember." It was not a cry, it was a whisper. But history, I think, is made of whispers. By the late Safavid years, the palace became a museum of its own myths. The kings drank wine forbidden by their faith. Poets mocked them in coded riddles, and the empire's borders frayed. Yet inside, the rituals continued unchanged. Weddings, processions, veils, blessings, like a play repeating itself long after the audience has gone. When the dynasty finally fell, it did so not with thunder, but with exhaustion. The masks had grown too heavy to wear, and somewhere in that collapse, I imagine, the daughters of Persia felt something they had never known before. Not freedom, not yet, but the faint tremor of a world where silence would no longer be the only language of survival. Empires do not die when their kings fall. They die when their stories lose conviction. Persia's dynasties rose and withered, yet their myths endured, burnished by poets, softened by scholars, retold until even cruelty began to sound like grace. I have walked through museums where fragments of those ages rest: a jeweled comb, a letter sealed in dust, a painting of a faceless bride. Each relic whispers the same thing: that beauty was once mistaken for safety. And perhaps that is the tragedy at the core of every civilization that worships perfection. It forgets the cost of appearing flawless. When I speak of these princesses, these women whose names history smudged, I am not recounting ghosts. I am tracing the anatomy of control. Their fear was not an isolated superstition. It was policy disguised as piety, etiquette wrapped around anxiety. The ceremony, the seclusion, the silence, each was an instrument tuned to maintain harmony for those above them. Even now, in modern cities built upon their ruins, the architecture of that fear survives in subtler forms. The expectation to smile, to remain agreeable, to bear heritage like a crown, those are echoes of the same instruction that once kept palaces immaculate. But history, mercifully, is never entirely obedient. In every century, someone looks back and questions the script. As I read the chronicles of later empires, Qajar, Pahlavi, the early modern state, I find brief flashes of rebellion dressed as decorum. A poem circulated in secret salons, a portrait painted with the sitter's gaze meeting the viewers directly, a queen who commissioned translations of forbidden texts. They were small ruptures, but enough to let the light in. What fascinates me most is not how the fear was born, but how it was remembered. Generations carried the weight of that silence without naming it, yet the memory persisted, not as trauma alone, but as instinct, a cautionary rhythm in the cultural heartbeat. You can still hear it in the music of the region, the long pauses between notes, the way the melody hesitates before daring to resolve. You can see it in the poetry, where longing and restraint entwine like vines around an old gate. Every hesitation is an inheritance. And yet I do not tell this story to condemn Persia alone. No culture is innocent of dressing power in the language of virtue. Every age has its palace, every palace its veils. When I lecture about these histories, someone always asks, were they unhappy? I never know how to answer. Happiness is a word invented by those who have choices. What the princesses sought was not joy, but survival with dignity, a kind of quiet strength that does not make chronicles, but shapes them nonetheless. Sometimes I imagine one of them, not any single name, but a composite of all who endured, standing at a window before dawn, watching the first light fall over tiled roofs. She cannot flee, cannot speak, but she understands something profound, that even silence, observed long enough, becomes testimony. That is why I tell their stories now, not to reopen wounds, but to listen for the heartbeat beneath the centuries of ritual and restraint. History offers few redemptions, but it does offer perspective. And when we peer through the lattice of those vanished palaces, we glimpse ourselves, the same species forever balancing beauty against conscience, ceremony against compassion. So if you have listened this far, remember, the past is not buried. It breathes through every custom we inherit unquestioned, every comfort we mistake for virtue. The lesson of the Persian princesses is not their fear, it is our recognition of it. The next time you stand before an old painting or walk through a corridor echoing with polished silence, ask yourself, what was hidden to make this beauty possible? Because only when we dare to ask that question does history truly speak. And perhaps, somewhere beyond time's veil, those silent daughters of empire will finally be heard, not as victims, but as witnesses. If you're drawn to hidden histories like this, stay with me. There are more voices waiting beneath the dust. Subscribe, share where you're listening from, and never forget that the loveliest stories often hide the darkest truths.